Now, as usual with my live streams, I will post my Patreon right up there at the top, the patreon.com/challenge history, for those who want to donate. Now, when it comes down to people, what people are going to want to know is they're probably going to want to know what happened with my situation, why I did not do a day live stream today. That's because I was waiting for my I was waiting for a package. Actually, I was switching over my mobile phone carrier, so I was waiting for a couple of phones to come in today. And that actually, because FedEx took a long time to deliver it, and it took a while for me to set up the phones, I could not do my morning live stream. And so it delayed a lot of things during the day, because the phones did not arrive until like 2:30 when they were supposed to arrive at about noon. Now, this was a huge problem, but I was able to at least get out the normal podcast for the day, and that's uploading right now as we speak to YouTube, as while we're right during the live stream. And with this live stream, we're basically going Juan Guaido. You'll see the topic: Juan Guaido, president or not. And this is basically going over the idea of what happened with the State Department press briefing. And what really happened was the State Department press secretary decided to use political correctness on the press themselves, and tried to assert that this person, that Juan Guaido, is the interim president. Now, this is quite interesting, because when we look at this, we see that Juan Guaido has not gotten any support. He's not been elected. He is a person who has not been had any type of election other than congressional. He essentially had to exile himself because of lack of support, and this is something that's quite interesting because of his situation. When we look at him, his number of supporters was about 700 people. Now, when we talk about the number of people in Venezuela, we're talking near about 32 million people. 700 people, as we've talked before, is nowhere near the amount to get support. So thus, naming him as president, even though we have the numbers from what they've declared is about 50 nations, actually about 56 to be clear as the total from what we have so far. Now, if we look at the number of nations in the UN, we see the UN nations list. We'll see that when we look at that, you'll see that the number of nations is 193. We see that's 56 divided by 193. You will see that percentage-wise, it's about 29%. Hardly this is the national support that he has gotten when it comes to the other nations around the globe, within the other UN nations supporting him. So he's only getting about 29. He's only getting 29% support of the UN nations. When it comes to the actual people within his country, he is getting less than 1% of the support. So frankly, what this is only what we're talking is only a validation for a coup of an actual sovereign nation. Now, when we look at if someone were to basically come into the United States and say that a person who got basically almost no votes, let's say, for instance, someone comes into the country stating that for instance, that's let's say someone says that Lindsey Graham should be president. Someone comes in basically saying, oh, during the election, Lindsey Graham is deserving to be president. So what they do is they go in and they basically say, he's what it called. He's the declared leader. They grab up about 29% of the UN countries, and then they basically declare him as the leader. They'll basically go and they basically stage these things from their State Department, declaring him as the actual incoming president, regardless that there has not been an election, and regardless that they have no support. And this is basically what they're doing, and they're basically using essentially political correctness to essentially correct people from when they're stating that he is an opposition leader. Now, the reason why they're doing this is because they know if he's listed as an opposition leader, people are going to look at the real numbers. And that brings out to what it really is. And if they look at him as an opposition leader, they're going to look at his actual tactics, and that he has used violent tactics. And it gets you to the idea of really looking at what's really going on. And that's the whole point of what needs to be understood with this whole situation. Because when we look at what should be done is, if we're going to embrace the idea of what would traditionally be done in a free society, and essentially that's what we're trying to embrace. I mean, if we're supposed to be embracing the idea of a free society, should we not be embracing allowing people to call it whatever they want to, and not trying to force the media to use whatever words that the State Department is trying to enforce? Which means that they're basically trying to enforce certain language, and that would essentially be the exact opposite of what the idea of freedom and liberty are. And that's essentially what you're seeing from these people. And essentially, if we're talking from a presidency that was supposed to be completely against the idea of political correctness, this is exactly the opposite of what we should have expected. When we have when we had an opposition to Trump being Hillary Clinton, and she was talking about calling illegal aliens undocumented residents, and he was rightfully calling them illegal aliens, and people are saying that's not the politically correct term. Well, the fact is you don't correct someone's speech. They're allowed to speak as they want. Well, he's allowing his State Department to essentially revert to what Hillary Clinton wanted. Well, it's not surprising that we have a State Department acting like this, because we have a person, Secretary Pompeo, that was asking for tips from former Secretary Clinton, which is not much of a surprise when he was contacting her, asking her for tips. And the fact is, when we have a lot of these other people like John Bolton there, that are basically were actually supporting and did vote for Hillary Clinton when she was running. So when we're looking at this, basically that's essentially what you're getting. That's why you got this outcome. Now, that's why you're not going to get the idea of supporting these ideas of freedom and liberty. That if you were to actually want to export those ideas to begin with, this is not the way you go about it. Now, when we look at the other idea with it, we know that basically that if they could not change the idea of the way speech goes, they know that they could not justify the intervention, because the fact is they would have to call him exactly what Guaido is, and we cannot claim that Maduro is anything good, But the fact is he is a legitimate leader. We can't change that. But what you can do is you could say what Guaido is. You could say that he is a violent thug, and this is what we've been able to prove by him basically wanting to use these violent rallies to overthrow Maduro. And this shows that basically that is not something that would essentially be equal to what would be on the lines of something that would embrace liberty and freedom. That's somebody who's going to essentially use violence and force to get his way. And that's essentially what he's trying to do, which means when he gets in power and anything comes in his way, he's going to be using violence and force to suppress anything he doesn't like. And when we see that, if we're thinking that it's going to be any better under Guaido, it's probably going to be worse. Because what we're talking about is he's going to essentially be a lot more brutal. Because what's caused Maduro to act to enforce violence with his military has been the effect of economic collapse. What causes Guaido to act out is when he doesn't have his ideal outcome of power. Total difference in the situation. It's completely opposite of what happens. Now, when you look at the two, Maduro doesn't do this stuff when he's essentially not getting his way. Maduro only does it when he actually has a situation where things are not economically looking good and people are rioting, so he tends to use excessive force. Not saying that's good, but we can actually see where that's coming from, and there are actual legitimate changes that can be done to fix those problems. With Maduro, with Guaido, I should say, Guaido, there's no problems you can fix that other than basically throwing him in jail, because he's no different than a guy like Che Guevara. Essentially, that's what we're putting in office. You're essentially taking a guy like Castro and replacing him with Che Guevara. And anybody who knows anything the least about Che Guevara, you know that Che Guevara was basically a murderous psychopath. And he pretty much would kill women and children first, and he was hardly any type of nice person. And he enjoyed killing, and this is why when it comes down to it, is even the Cuban regime went after Guevara, and he was exiled from them for his insanity of how much he would go to kill people. So when we look at the actual situation, we can see that there's a big difference. Now when we look at the case of the next part, is we need to look at what's going on with the idea of how they want to how it's being even enforced with the idea of Marco Rubio. Now Marco Rubio has even gone on the idea of attacking the different media outlets for not suggesting Guaido as the actual president. Now this is continuing the idea, and this shows that they're worried that people will not accept him as the actual president, and are worried that people will actually state the actual facts as is. And they're worried about this. They're worried that propaganda is not setting in. And they're worried that people will not let this propaganda set in, that the neoconservative propaganda won't. And this is something they're worried that it's not going to continue. Now, major reason why this probably won't is because the fact is your major neoconservative rags traditionally don't, and even with your legacy media, your legacy media out there is not highly supported. When we look at the when we look at the support of media, we see that basically is that's actually we see that's actually been at an all-time low when we start to analyze those numbers, and it's actually been quite and it's since those numbers are at an all-time low, even for doesn't matter what party we're talking about, those numbers are sitting usually at the latest numbers. We're talking somewhere around the mid-30s, and that's usually a conglomerate number. That's usually a combined number between both Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, and it does tend to vary by each one, but all of them are usually pretty low. This kind of shows that when it comes down to it, is no single party actually supports anything that they're saying. So even with a lot of the legacy media having a left-wing bias, even the people on the left wing don't even trust their own bias that they're actually getting. Even they don't like it, and that this should give an actual clue that any type of propaganda that gets put out is going to be met with a high amount of skepticism. That even at the highest numbers we're talking for any party, which would be mostly left wingers, which would be at around 40% support. I mean, that still shows a 60% skepticism of the legacy media. And when we're looking at that refers to newspapers and mainstream television news, and this includes local news as well. So when they're actually putting out the news for this should show that they can't exactly have the impact that they once did, and it's dropped dramatically. And to actually have this and then not have the impact, we're talking that they would not be able to influence people to go to war what they were once. Even just basically what we're talking about 15 to 20 years ago, which they were able to for both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And this is where people like Marco Rubio are essentially on the attack, because they know that the time for this neoconservatism propaganda is coming to an end. We had the I believe it was the yeah, what was the last one? Was the yeah, for what was the thing? Yeah, I'm trying to find right now the magazine that you had like the Weekly Standard, which is a when we look at the Weekly Standard, you see that the Weekly Standard, which is the major neoconservative magazine, which is from Bill Kristol, you see that went under, and this is really kind of showing that this is the actual standing of where people view neoconservatism outside of the Beltway. And that's kind of where people need to view this. And that people need to understand that when it comes to neoconservatism, is that it's pretty much dead. And people like John Bolton, people like Marco Rubio, people like Bill Kristol, even like the other ones that claim themselves as being more on the liberal end, with like Fareed Zakaria, that are still pursuing these ideals, these neoconservative ideals. They need to understand that it's pretty, and those ones like Hillary Clinton as well, they need to understand the whole idea of this intervention is dead, because it just doesn't exist anymore, because people don't support it, and when it comes down to it, is people are sick of it, and you're going to find a lot of people that are going to go against it. And speaking of like guys in John Bolton, even John Bolton has tried to come up with the idea of trying to threaten people who do business with with the actual real Venezuelan leader Maduro, to try to push their ideal leader Juan Guiado. And this is where we get to that point, and it needs to be understood that this is where we're at, and he's trying to do this with it, and he's trying to do the ideas of sanctions for any type of people that are actually working with them. Now, when we look at that, this is essentially, they're doing sanctions for companies that are acting in the nature of capitalism, which ironically is the economic system that we're trying to give to Venezuela. Which is quite humorous, because essentially you're essentially trying to punish people for engaging in an activity in which you want Venezuela to engage into. So if you want to essentially convert them over to capitalism, you're essentially being a very, very bad steward of it by actually doing these sanctions. Essentially, you should eliminate sanctions and eliminate any punishment of people actually doing business with them, and actually open up the door to it. And this is the way to actually move them. You're actually going to move them through ideas, not through actual force and trying to put in a new leader. The way to do this, you might actually be able to convert Maduro. You want to convert the ideas, not the actual people. Converting the people is not going to do any good, because you get poor leaders that way. And that's the whole point that needs to be made, that needs to be actually shown here, is that when you try to just put in a leader. Now, when you start to look at when we try to put in leaders, the end road of it tends to be very, very bad outcomes. And that's what we need to understand, is when we start to look at it. And we'll understand very, very quickly is that the outcome of this is going to be very, very different. Such as if we start to look at the case of a person like, or a case like our intervention in Iran, where we were propping up the Shah. The Shah was eventually thrown out, even after multiple attempts where we tried to assassinate duly elected leaders that were basically elected by the actual people, and that our government didn't like. Eventually what happened is they went to the Ayatollah system and were putting them in, and it essentially gave a government that was hostile to the United States. And it ended up boiling over in the late 70s with the hostage crisis. And it wouldn't have happened that way had we not intervened in the first place and let them, as a sovereign nation, choose their own leaders. And this is what happens when you do intervention and you try to choose a country's leaders. You never want to be doing that. Countries that do that end up in very, very poor situations. This is something that you end up really, really bad off situations that you never want to be in. And if you start to look at it, if a country were to basically say, you know what, we're basically going to decide uh, that Trump's not the United States president, we're going to intervene and we're going to make another guy president just because we don't like Trump. Let's say a bunch of countries in the UN decided this because Trump got out of the Paris Climate Accord. They didn't like that, so basically they're going to come in and they're basically going to make their own decisions for the United States, and they're going to do this because they don't like Trump. Well, the fact is the United States voters are going to be very, very angry, and they're going to say, well, why did you put in some person? Because the fact is we voted for this person. It's our country. If we wanted to put in another person, we would have, and this is not fair at all. And that's basically what we're talking about here. And when we start to look at it, is you need to be looking from a constitutional manner. And this is where we get this, and you need to respect a nation's sovereignty. Now, you might not like their current leader, you might not approve of them, but the nation chose them. And if the nation's in a lot of problems, they need to kind of unbury themselves. And this is just where things need to come from. And if you look at it, is you're not going to unbury yourself by actually looking at a situation to where you're going and you're intervening into every country. When it comes down to protecting your own sovereignty and protecting your own national interest, your national interest is in protecting your own country itself. There's no interest in protecting other countries and in installing other leaders. The only interest you have is in your own country. That's it. There's no reason to go and intervene in other countries. There's no reason to basically go to war for other countries. It really doesn't matter. There basically is, it should be about just your own country itself. Now, you have the idea of diplomatic relations between two countries, but that's a complete other issue, and you can do that, but the fact is there should be no reason that you should have that you should be in an alliance with another country, nor should be there any reason that you should intervene for on a free country. You should only focus on your own country, and you should be worrying about only what matters to your own country. No country should be actually looking into your politics and starting to basically intervene on your actual country. Any country that does essentially should be considered an enemy. And if they do, you should definitely consider giving them a warning before you actually tell them if they keep doing it, you will start putting sanctions on their country if they keep trying to lobby your politicians. And I could definitely see that if you're going to sanction them for lobbying. But otherwise than that, you should not be sanctioning other countries. It really does not even matter, because you should just be looking at trade from one nation to another. And you should be avoiding war at all costs, because war should only be used for defending your own sovereignty and defending when you've actually been attacked. And if your nation has not been attacked, then you should have no bearing on it, and you should not have bases everywhere. And this is basically what the United States has done, is spread herself really, really thin by going everywhere. We don't need to be the policeman of the world. We don't need to actually have a presence around the world. And you don't need to be a superpower. You can be a superpower by being an economic superpower, by being the U.S. as a huge consumer of goods is by itself a superpower, because essentially if they decide they're not going to consume these type of goods in this month, they could essentially have massive control on the market. That's what a superpower can do. A superpower does not mean you're going to essentially exert your military force. You don't need to exert any military force to be a superpower. It just means it just should be for what economic force you have. Military force means nothing. It just means you're killing innocent people. And when it comes with it, there's no reason why we should be even involved. Venezuela is not our country. The issue with these people have nothing to do with us, nor any other country involved, and they can solve their own issues. When it comes down to aid with it, we do not have to politicize any of it. There were other countries around the area that we could have given aid to if Maduro did not want to accept aid because of the high risk. But the fact is we wanted it to go there because of the politicization of the whole thing. And that's why with it, because we wanted to, the whole idea was to overthrow Maduro from the start and essentially use it as a Trojan horse to get that point. This is why when you have these crazy people like John Bolton, like Marco Rubio, like Elliot Abrams, that are complete and utter psychopaths, can actually do these ideas. I mean, when it comes down to that, the initial idea of that Space Force was not Donald Trump's. This is actually an idea that came out of crazy Marco Rubio's mouth. So when it comes down to these crazy ideas, they're coming out of the mouths of these neocons, these people that they can't have enough war. If there isn't blood running in the streets, they're not happy. And they don't care whose blood it is, as long as it's not theirs, because they sure as hell don't want to be harmed. They basically run out of harm's way, because they want to make sure that they and their family don't get involved, because obviously we can't have that. We can't have them basically be consistent with what they're saying. With basically, if they're going to basically send people to war, they actually be front in line. And frankly, I think basically, if you're going to send people to war, you better be front in line to basically defend it. And if you want to basically do this, that should be what you're going to do. And if people like John Bolton want to send people to war, he better be front in line to lead them. And if he has his head blown off because of it, well, it's his own fault, because he was the one stupid enough to actually want to play regime change. But I guarantee you, if that was the case, if you wanted to go to war, and if you were the one that wanted to go to war, and that was the case you had to go to war, I guarantee you, he would be a bigger non-interventionist than Ron Paul is. He'd make Ron Paul seem like a neocon when it comes to these things. And that's the whole fact of it, because we know the fact is he's a complete and utter chicken when it comes to these things. He just wants to send other people to die because he only wants the actual financial benefits of these things. Same thing when it comes to guys like Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is just some loser lawyer from Florida who basically developed a bunch of credit card debt and wants to basically send people to die because he thinks it's a good idea, and he knows that the military contractors are going to essentially give him a nice little benefit in his pocketbook. And every time he runs, they're going to essentially give him a lot of money. And this is the way things go, and they know that no one else will. Because when it comes down to everything that actually matters, they know that he's basically going to go on one of these big spending sprees for the military, and he's not exactly going to be a big friend to liberty. That's why he's going on the idea of attacking anybody who wants to actually call Guaido what he is, and he's only the opposition, and he wants to say, well, oh, is Nancy Pelosi just the opposition, or is she the Speaker of the House? Well, no. That would be saying Maduro being being the opposition. No, that would be the equivalent, because she is actually the duly elected person. You actually have to run an election for that. There was actually an election that made Nancy Pelosi the Speaker of the House. This would be equal to basically like stating that someone who never ran for Speaker gets to basically be appointed Speaker. Or someone who you basically want to make Speaker. Hey, I want to make I've wanted to make Thomas Massie Speaker. Basically, does that mean Thomas Massie's the new Speaker of the House? I'd like to do that with it. We don't need to have a vote for that. Okay, Thomas Massie's the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Pelosi has to step down, and the new majority leader of the House of Representatives is not Kevin McCarthy anymore. It's now Jim Jordan, and it's effective immediately. It doesn't matter what they state with it. This is the way things have to be. And it doesn't matter what way the actual numbers go in the House with it. This is just the way it goes. And for all the appointments for the committees, the Republicans are now majority. And this is the way it goes. It doesn't matter. We've all of a sudden just decided that the Republicans are now the majority, and all the committee members are now either members of the Freedom Caucus or members of the Republican Liberty Caucus. And this is how these things are going to go from now on. Same thing in the Senate. Is the majority leader in the Senate is now Rand Paul. And the president now is going to be of the country is now going to be Ron Paul, and he's going to essentially make his own staff, and all the neocons are going to be shipped out, and by decree we're going to get rid of all the civilian intelligence. Just because we're just going to do this by decree now. Now, can we do this? No. With it, this is not how things get done. And this is something that all these neocons need to realize. You can't just all of a sudden do this, all of a sudden start marching in and just start making demands. If this were the case with it, I think that a lot of liberty people would have already pro-liberty people would have already kicked out a lot of these neocons a long time ago. I think that things would be a lot different, and I think we would have a lot of these positions a lot different. I think we'd say, oh, you don't follow the Constitution, boom, you're gone. Oh, you don't want to follow the Constitution, boom, you're gone. And we basically start reducing these people down and start kicking out these departments, and these things would be a lot different, and it would get done in about 1 week. But the fact is since it's not constitutional, and since there's actually rules about that, and since people don't like to get assaulted, it would be a lot different. People usually, especially if you want to follow the non-aggression principle, it would be kind of against your principle to assault people as well. But this is basically what we're talking about here. Is basically what we're doing here is essentially we're going on in Venezuela, and we're essentially violating every one of our principles and saying, oh, don't do what we did, do what we say, what we want you to do. And guess what's going to happen is he's not going to. He's going to essentially follow all these ideas of what we just did to put them in power. and he's going to be abusive to all the people, and it's going to be 10 times worse than what Maduro could even dream of doing. And that's why when we try to put in these leaders, why it always fails is because of this. And we can't keep doing this, and that's why he's not the real president. There wasn't any election. The actual last election was actually for Maduro, which he won. Guaido was basically just a congressional person. Guaido's actual support group is about 700 people. When you're talking the number of countries that actually support you is basically within basically 1/14 of your actual supporters of Venezuelans. I mean, it's kind of pathetic. I mean, that shouldn't be that high. It's actually, yeah, we're talking like 1/14 of the supporters. Because he has about 700 supporters. He doesn't have many supporters. I mean, there should be a huge difference between the number of countries supporting you next to about the number of actual people that support you. There should be a huge difference between it. That's basically like, and even with the actual people in the other countries that support them, from these leaders and such, the number of people from those countries that total it, I guarantee you that number is actually higher than his actual real supporters in his actual own country. And that's what's pathetic. If you look at this, we can actually see that his actual numbers of supporters in his own country is lower. And we're supposed to elect a guy president who can't even who has supporters out of his country larger than his supporters in his own country. I'm sorry with it, but when we're looking at that, we need to say, sorry dude, but you're not the president. He couldn't even gain 1% of the vote. I mean, you're talking is in this country, you're talking a person from the Communist Party of the United States of America would gain more votes in the United States per the actual population. When we actually average out the populations, it would actually be a higher thing. Basically, they would get approximately a higher amount of people voting for them than he would actually get in his own country. This shows you how pathetic Juan Guaido is as when it comes to people that support him for an actual presidential leader. He's not liked in his own country. He's considered to be a thug. He's even if he would run congressionally again, it's not likely that he would even win when it comes down to it. So when we look at this, is we see that he probably would lose, because people see more of who he is, and he would probably end up losing a congressional race, which means he wouldn't even finish that well. I mean, you're talking, he has about the popularity of someone like Jeff Flake in the United States, where he was thinking initially he was going to run for president, and then realized he couldn't even win his actual Congress seat back, and in the case of Jeff Flake being the Senate seat. Look at Juan Guaido, you can see it's the same thing there. He would probably not even be able to win that back. And by trying to proclaim a guy president that has no popularity, I mean, this is what we're talking about here. This is a person who's not that popular. I mean, you could pretty much go around the Congress of Venezuela and pretty much pick almost anybody else. Just start picking random people. Pick a random person in the actual country. It doesn't really matter. You can pick a random person in the country. They probably have more than 700 supporters that they can grab up. I mean, it really doesn't matter. You could pick some random hobo down the street in Venezuela, and they probably can find 700. They probably can find over 700 supporters. They would actually support them, and they'd probably be a much better leader than Juan Guaido. They might not look as pretty, but the fact is they would definitely be a better leader. They might actually be a leader that would actually possibly adapt the ideas of laissez-faire capitalism, and they definitely are not going to be a leader that's going to try and assault their political enemies. The idea should not be is to bring in an actual thug. The reason why he has some of these supporters in there is because the fact is he's for regime change. Meaning that when it comes down to it, is he's going to be all on board for any regime change out there. That's why he's gathered 56 countries. That's why Guaido's done this. That means any type of regime change you want to run, he's going to be completely on board. He's had this study in regime change, so when he wants to use his military and you call upon him, he's going to say, hey military, we're going here. And whoever they want to basically overthrow, they can do it. And this is basically what they want, what they want to use Venezuela for. They want to use it for the military and have them overthrow countries. And this essentially is abuse of the actual people. When we look, if we're going to look at them as an actual free people, we should let them determine their own outcome. And I think that needs to be very important. And if they are not ready to determine their outcome yet, just let them have the current leadership, remove all sanctions. Because the fact is the sanctions don't do anything on the leadership. They just hurt the lives of the average people. And this is what needs to be understood. And the only thing it does with it is you're just trying to make the lives of the average people worse with the hopes that you're going to get regime change. And that's the whole idea. And this is why the idea of sanctions is not a productive idea of capitalism, and you're not being a good steward of capitalism when you're using sanctions. And sanctions is really essentially an act of war, because you're essentially trying to push for that, because you're trying to push for them to do a regime change. And that's the reason why. And when you do this, that's essentially what you're doing right there when you're pushing for sanctions. That's why you should be highly against sanctions no matter what the country is. Unless you're willing to go to war with that country, do not push for sanctions. And that's why when we view this stuff, we need to view it on that line. And when we see the people that are pushing for it, we should view those same people on the same lines. This is why when we see people like Bernie Sanders pushing for sanctions on Russia, you should realize that he's just as much of a warmonger. He just doesn't want to show it when it comes down to these progressive voters, because he knows that will definitely lose him a lot of voters, because they don't want to see him as a person who's going to be going to war over nothing. The reason why he's trying to promise that he'll downsize the military is because of he knows that that's a popular thing to hear. But when it comes down to it, really, is he's voted to actually stop the president from pulling out of NATO. Well, if you're not willing to pull out of NATO, that means you have no interest in downsizing the military, because that would be the easiest way to downsize the military, is to pull out of NATO. And there's no other easy way than that. Because it means if you're going to essentially downsize our actual actions, there's no easier act than to pull out of NATO. That's a good chunk of our money that's going out into military expenditures. That's why when we start to look at what we do as an actual country, that should be our first step. And when we look at this whole case of really who's the actual legitimate leader of Venezuela, we need to understand that we shouldn't be making that determination. The determination should solely be made by Venezuela themselves. And this is where the whole problem is we're not making the whole, we're not allowing the decision to be made naturally. And this is something that's quite problematic with the whole way that the system has developed since really the progressive era, and we've done this so that basically we can intervene on a lot of other countries. And really we don't have the right to determine what another country is going to create its government as, because we don't have any other right to determine our any government's right to exist in its own sovereignty other than our own. We can decide for ourselves, nobody else. We don't have the right to decide for anybody else, and you cannot make any argument based on feelings. There's no such thing as an argument based on feelings that makes any rational sense. The only arguments that actually make rational sense are those that are based on fact. And you can't make an argument that says we should intervene based on fact, because there is no legitimate thing, because it says that we would essentially violate their rights as a sovereign country to make their own decisions as how they feel that they should be run as their own country. The only way that someone would be able to make an argument is based on feelings, and if we know the feelings do not make a rational argument, we know that they cannot make a rational argument. Their whole thing is they tend to go on, communism or socialism is evil. Well, that's not a rational argument. You have to make a rational argument that states that there is some other reason other than you don't like their economic system, and that they need to be saved, and these other things like this, which are basically on that idea of using feelings to make that argument. You need to basically validate an argument that states that there is some reason that you have to essentially violate their right to sovereignty. And frankly, there isn't, because when you go with that idea, you need to say you need to respect their rights as individual people to make their own decisions. And you can't say, well, it's not happening there as a country. Well, the fact is they have the right to do it on their own. If they're not getting respected as individual citizens as a country, they have the right to actually revolt and replace the leader. If that leader is being a tyrant, they have the right to overthrow that leader on their own. It does not take intervention to do so. And that's the whole point. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, make sure to share us on social media, and make sure to check out my Patreon page, and make sure to see if other people can check out my Patreon page as well, because I don't get any ad revenue, this is actually currently free, and I need at least some type of ad revenue, or some type of revenue, I would say, because I'm not currently making any money, and it would really help me to basically make at least some type of money. Bye, everyone.